Michael Bettaney pushed a bulging envelope through the letterbox of the Soviet Embassy's Kensington Palace Gardens residence on the night of April 3rd, 1983. Inside sat classified MI5 assessments of KGB operations in London, the offering of a security service officer who had decided over months of drink and grievance that he wanted to work for Moscow. The residency's counterintelligence chief, Oleg Gordievsky, opened the package the following morning. He was also a British agent. He read Bettaney's material, filed it inside the residentura, and then, through a dead letter procedure that ran back to Sentry House, told his London handlers what had happened. The traitor was arrested 5 months later, but Gordievsky's traffic in the summer of 1983 pointed at something else. Something Whitehall had already been tracking for the best part of 2 decades. An obsessive Soviet appetite for British armour secrets, and above all for the design papers of one specific tank. The Chieftain had entered service with the British Army of the Rhine in 1966. By the early 1980s it was aging, over-engineered and unloved by its own crews who complained about the Leyland L60 engine breaking down on the North German plain. Yet inside 3rd Shock Army headquarters at Magdeburg, and at the GRU's Technical Directorate in Moscow, the Chieftain was regarded as the most important Western tank of the Cold War. The machine that had rewritten the arithmetic of a Warsaw Pact push across the inner German border. Its 120mm rifled gun could kill a T-62 at ranges Soviet gunners could not answer. Its Horseman suspension let it fire accurately from a hull-down position on a reverse slope. And from the late 1970s, its turret carried something the Soviets could not yet identify from satellite photography or defector debriefs. A composite armor array developed at the Ministry of Defence's Fighting Vehicles Research and Development Establishment at Chobham Common in Surrey. Chobham Armor. The name was a location. The composition was one of the most closely held secrets in NATO. It layered ceramic tiles, elastic materials and steel in a sandwich that defeated shaped charge warheads at a fraction of the weight of equivalent rolled homogeneous steel. American engineers briefed at Chobham in 1973 went home and built the M1 Abrams around a licensed version. West Germany followed with Leopard 2. British defense attachés at the embassies in Bonn, Washington and Ottawa were instructed by the Ministry of Defense under written directive from Defense Secretary Fred Mulley in 1976 that Chobham's precise recipe was to be discussed with no foreign national under any circumstances, Allied or not. The Soviets understood what they were missing. The GRU's 3rd Directorate opened a formal collection requirement, designated in Moscow's tasking cables as a priority technical target, against the Royal Ordnance Factory at Leeds, against the FVRDE at Chertsey, and against the British Army training grounds at Bovington in Dorset, where trials tanks were run. From 1968 onwards, KGB Line X officers in the London Residency were passing tasking sheets to trade delegates, journalists, students, and occasionally to sympathetic academics requesting anything at all. Sales brochures, engineering journals, dinner party gossip, that touched on the Chieftain, its ammunition, its fire control, or the mysterious ceramic being fitted to the export variants sold to Iran. By 1978, the Joint Intelligence Committee in the Cabinet Office was reading, week after week, GCHQ intercepts of Warsaw Pact radio traffic that showed Soviet armoured formations rehearsing tactics designed specifically to overwhelm Chieftain positions on the North German plain. Somebody, somewhere in the British system, was leaking. The first indication came from a defector in Ottawa. In September 1971, a GRU officer named Yevgeny Ushakov walked into the RCMP's Security Service headquarters and offered material that ricocheted within 48 hours to MI5's D branch at Curzon Street House in Mayfair. Ushakov had served in London between 1966 and 1969 under diplomatic cover at the Soviet trade delegation in Highgate. He named 3 technical targets his residency had prioritized: the Concorde airframe, the Polaris warhead program at Aldermaston, and something he called only the new British battle tank. D Branch, then run by Michael Hanley, matched Ushakov's testimony against the mass expulsion of 105 Soviet intelligence officers Edward Heath had ordered on September 24, 1971. Operation Foot, the largest single strike against a hostile intelligence service any Western government had ever mounted. The expulsions had crippled the KGB and GRU residencies in London for the better part of the decade. But by the time Ushakov's debrief reached Curzon Street, MI5 already understood that Foot had not sealed the leaks. It had merely made them harder to find. Soviet illegals, officers operating without diplomatic cover, remained in place. So did agents recruited before 1971 who continued to service dead drops in the home counties without ever meeting a case officer. The Chieftain project offered the Soviets an unusually broad attack surface. Design work had been spread across Vickers at Elswick on the Tyne, the Royal Ordnance Factory at Leeds, Rolls-Royce Diesel at Shrewsbury, and a spider's web of subcontractors making sighting equipment, fire control computers, and gun barrels. Each site employed thousands of engineers with security clearances of varying rigor. Trade union representatives passed freely between them. Design drawings were reproduced on unclassified microfilm for distribution to production floors. And after 1971, when Iran's Imperial Armed Forces placed an order for 707 Chieftain, Mark 5/2s and later the improved FV4030/1, the drawings began travelling to Tehran under commercial rather than military security protocols. The Iranian sale would prove the widest crack in the wall. Sir Shapur Reporter, an Anglo-Iranian intermediary who had helped broker the deal, moved between London, Tehran and Zurich, carrying briefcases whose contents the Ministry of Defence had catalogued but could not physically guarantee. Iranian officers trained at Bovington. Iranian technicians studied at the Royal Military College of Science at Shrivenham. When the Shah fell in February 1979 and Ayatollah Khomeini's revolutionary regime inherited an armoured corps built around British machinery, the Ministry of Defence in Whitehall convened an emergency review under the Chief Scientific Advisor. The review's classified conclusion, held in the National Archives at Kew under file DEFE24, was blunt. It had to be assumed that complete Chieftain technical documentation was now in Tehran and might already be en route to Moscow. It was. Within 18 months, GCHQ was reading Warsaw Pact signals that referred, in the workmanlike prose of Soviet armoured doctrine, to specific Chieftain vulnerabilities that had not been public knowledge in 1978. The turret ring's weakness under top attack munitions, the engine deck's thermal signature, the precise angle at which the glacis plate defeated 115mm APFSDS. At Sentry House on the South Bank, Sir Arthur Dickey Franks, the chief of the Secret Intelligence Service, ordered his Sovblock controllerate to run a specific enquiry. Who inside Britain still was providing tasked updates to the GRU on Chieftain modifications after 1979? Geoffrey Prime had been arrested in Cheltenham in April 1982 on unrelated charges relating to sexual offences against children. When Wiltshire police searched his house at 94 Pitville Crescent Lane, they found, tucked inside a briefcase in the loft, one-time pads, a miniature Minox camera, and typed instructions in Russian describing dead drop sites in the Vienna woods. Prime had been a GCHQ linguist for 9 years. He had betrayed to the KGB the full details of the British-American SIGINT alliance, the location and productivity of listening stations across West Germany, and MI5 discovered as it worked backwards through his career. Every summary paper that had crossed his desk concerning Soviet armoured formations opposite BAOR. That included tank material. Prime had not stolen Chieftain drawings, but he had told his handlers meeting by meeting from 1968 onwards exactly which Soviet transmissions the British were reading, and therefore exactly which Warsaw Pact tank exercises the JIC was watching. This allowed Moscow to work out in reverse what the British still did not know about their own equipment's vulnerabilities. The absence of concern in JIC assessments told the KGB where the Chieftain was thought to be strong. Everywhere else was, by inference, where it might be weak. The damage assessment convened in the summer of 1982 at Downing Street was chaired personally by the Cabinet Secretary Sir Robert Armstrong. Margaret Thatcher, briefed at Chequers by Sir Anthony Duff, the Foreign Office's senior official for intelligence, was described in Duff's contemporaneous handwritten note as, quietly, cold furious. The Prime Minister demanded to know how many other primes were, at that moment, sitting inside Britain's defence establishment. Duff could not answer. Neither could Sir John Jones, the Director General of MI5. Neither could Sir Colin Figures, who had succeeded Franks at SYS in 1981. What they could tell her, drawing on Gordievsky's product, was that the GRU had opened at least 3 new tasking lines against British armour between 1979 and 1982. One ran through Vienna, where a British engineer working on gun stabilisation systems attended a trade fair in October 1980, and had a series of conversations with a Hungarian metallurgist who was in fact a Warsaw Pact intelligence officer. A second ran through the Republic of Ireland, where Soviet bloc diplomats accredited to Dublin ran couriers into Northern Ireland to service drops in the home counties on their return. A third, the most alarming, appeared to be running through an unidentified serving officer in the British Army of the Rhine itself. Gordievsky's material, however, was carefully compartmented within the Sovblock Controllerate at SIS. He could not be tasked to hunt for the mole. To do so would risk exposing him. Instead, MI5's K branch quietly opened surveillance operations against a short list of BAOR officers whose postings, movements and finances raised questions. The list ran to 14 names in 1983. It included armour officers at the Royal Armoured Corps Centre at Bovington, at the BAOR headquarters at Rheindalen, and at the Directorate of Military Operations in the Old War Office Building at Horse Guards. Not one of the 14 was ever charged. 2 were quietly transferred to postings without technical access. The others cleared vetting. Whether the mole existed or whether Gordievsky's fragmentary product had been misread remains a question historians cannot yet resolve. The files at Kew relating to that 1983 vetting exercise are closed under Freedom of Information exemptions until 2039. What the Cabinet Office did know by the end of 1983 was that Soviet interest in Chieftain had not slackened. It had intensified. The intensification had a specific cause. On September 3, 1983, 6 days before Bettaney's arrest and 1 day after a Soviet Su-15 shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, a paper landed on Margaret Thatcher's desk from the Ministry of Defence's Chief Scientific Advisor, Sir Ronald Mason. The paper concerned a successor program to the Chieftain. It was designated MBT-80 in its earlier form and was by 1983 being reorganized as the Challenger 1. It carried a second-generation Chobham array. Its L-11 gun had been replaced by the new L-11A5, and it incorporated for the first time a digital fire control system that could hit a moving target at 2,000 meters while the tank itself was traversing broken ground at 40 kilometers per hour. Mason's paper concluded that the Challenger, entering service that year with the Royal Hussars at Tidworth, would give NATO armoured formations a decisive tactical advantage on the North German plain until at least 1995. He also warned the Prime Minister that the Soviet Union knew this, and that the KGB and GRU would now redouble efforts to acquire not only Challenger's specifications, but the manufacturing know-how required to replicate its Chobham array in Soviet steel mills. The GRU's collection strategy, reconstructed from Gordievsky's product and from parallel material provided by other agents whose identities remain classified, ran along 4 axes. The first was direct recruitment inside Vickers Defence Systems, which had absorbed the Royal Ordnance Factory production lines and was now the sole prime contractor for British main battle tanks. The second was penetration of the Ministry of Defence Procurement Executive at Foxhill, Bath, where contracts and technical specifications flowed between MOD and industry. The third was recruitment of retired officers with continuing consultancy roles. The fourth was the exploitation of academic research, funded by MoD but published in the open literature, into ceramic metal composites at Imperial College London, the University of Cambridge Department of Materials Science, and the AERE at Harwell. The academic vector concerned the security services most. MI5's F branch estimated in a paper of November 1983, released under the 30-year rule in 2013, that up to 20% of published British metallurgical research on multi-layer armour composites during 1978 to 1983 had material application to Soviet tank programs. The papers were not classified. They could not be classified without destroying the university sector's international standing. And Soviet scientific attachés at the embassy in Kensington Palace Gardens were subscribing to them, translating them into Russian, and cabling them to the Ministry of Defense Industry in Moscow within days of publication. Thatcher's response, formulated in a series of meetings with Michael Heseltine at the Ministry of Defense in autumn 1983, took two forms. Publicly, the government tightened the Official Secrets Act, a process that would culminate in the 1989 revisions. Privately, MI5 and SIS were tasked to run offensive counterintelligence operations against Soviet bloc scientific personnel operating in British universities. Some of these operations would come to light decades later. Others remain in the Cabinet Office phrase, matters upon which comment would not be appropriate. Gordievsky meanwhile continued to service his dead drops in Kensington and to meet his SIS handlers in a series of safe flats in Bayswater and Notting Hill. Between January and May 1985, he provided the material that would allow Thatcher, in her private meeting with Mikhail Gorbachev at Chequers on December 16, 1984, to say the famous line, "I like Mr. Gorbachev, we can do business together," with the confidence that came from knowing precisely what the new Soviet leader thought of her defense programs, and of the Chieftain's replacement now rolling off the production lines at Elswick. Then, in May 1985, Gordievsky was summoned to Moscow. The recall cable reached the London residency on May 16th. Gordievsky had been promoted to acting resident 3 months earlier, a promotion the KGB First Chief Directorate now wished to confirm formally at the Yasenevo headquarters. He was to fly to Moscow on May 19th. His wife Layla and their 2 young daughters were already there on summer leave. Gordievsky's SIS handler in London, a case officer known in the files only as James, met him for the last time in a Bayswater flat on the evening of May 17th. The handler proposed activating Operation Pimlico, a long-standing exfiltration plan that would extract Gordievsky and his family across the Finnish border in the boot of a British diplomatic car. Gordievsky refused. If he did not return to Moscow, he told James, the KGB would understand instantly that they had a mole. The counterintelligence purge that followed would burn every remaining Western asset inside the Soviet establishment. He would go. If he came back to London within 2 months, all was well. If he did not, Pimlico would run. He flew from Heathrow to Sheremetyevo on the morning of May 19th. He was taken by KGB car from the airport to a dacha outside Moscow, interrogated with the aid of what he later believed were psychoactive drugs, and questioned for 5 days about material only a mole could have known. He denied everything. The interrogation stopped. He was told he was no longer to return to London. He would be reassigned to internal duties at KGB headquarters. For 9 weeks, Gordievsky lived under KGB surveillance in a Moscow flat, unable to make contact with SIS, unable to know whether Pimlico had been briefed for activation, unable to know whether his wife and daughters were themselves under suspicion. He decided in the 3rd week of July that he had to run. On July 19th, 1985, standing on Kutuzovsky Prospect, at a particular moment in a particular manner, holding a Safeway carrier bag, the emergency signal for Pimlico, he was seen by an SIS officer walking past on the opposite pavement. The officer on rotational surveillance duty from the British Embassy at 14 Sofiskaya Naberezhnaya, returned to the embassy and cabled Century House. Sir Christopher Kirwan, the chief of SIS since 1985, briefed the Foreign Secretary Sir Geoffrey Howe. Howe briefed the Prime Minister. Thatcher authorised Pimlico. The exfiltration itself took place on July 19th and 20th. 2 SIS officers under diplomatic cover, driving with their wives in 2 Ford Sierras carrying diplomatic plates, drove north from Moscow towards the Finnish border. At a rendezvous point in a forest lay-by, they collected Gordievsky, who had shaken his KGB tail on a Leningrad train, and hid him in a specially modified boot with a foil lining to defeat thermal imaging at the border. At Vyborg, the KGB waved the diplomatic cars through. At Valimar on the Finnish side, at approximately 15:20 local time, on July 20th, 1985, Gordievsky stepped out of the boot into the arms of the SIS Helsinki station chief. He was flown to Fornebu, then to RAF Bryce Norton, then debriefed at a country house in Hampshire. His product had, over 11 years, allowed the Joint Intelligence Committee to warn NATO about Able Archer 83 and the Soviet false alarm nuclear posture that November. It had identified more than 100 KGB officers operating in Britain, and it had told Thatcher definitively that the GRU's hunt for Chieftain material had continued right up to the day he boarded that aircraft to Moscow. The hunt did not stop with his defection. It moved to Vienna, to Cyprus, and, most productively for Moscow, to the port of Aqaba on the Red Sea. Jordan had operated Chieftain variants since 1974. Iran, at war with Iraq since September 1980, was using its chieftains hard on the Khuzestan front, and losing them at a rate that meant hulls, turrets, and increasingly whole-intact vehicles were being captured by Iraqi forces or abandoned in the swamps. Iraq passed captured vehicles to its Soviet advisors under the Friendship Treaty signed in Moscow in 1972. By 1984, Kubinka, the Soviet armor proving ground west of Moscow, held at least 2 operational Chieftain Mark Vs, one substantially intact FV4030/1, and a warehouse of components, including gun barrels, sighting equipment, and, critically, a fragment of composite armor recovered from the turret of a vehicle destroyed near Basra in November 1982. The Kubinka fragment gave Soviet metallurgists their first physical sample of Chobham armor. It was, in the reconstruction pieced together later by Whitehall analysts, an early-generation composite. Nothing like the second-generation array on the Challenger. But it was enough. Combined with the open literature research the KGB scientific attachés were harvesting from British universities, and combined with whatever the GRU had extracted through its human sources, it allowed the Kartsev Design Bureau at Nizhny Tagil to develop the T-72B's reactive and composite armor package, introduced in 1985. That package was still inferior to what the Chieftain and Challenger carried, but the gap was closing. Whitehall knew about the Kubinka collection by late 1983. GCHQ's intercepts, cross-referenced with satellite photography from American KH-11 birds shared under the UK-USA arrangements, showed the traffic. The problem was that Britain could do nothing about vehicles the Iraqis had captured on a battlefield. The Foreign Office reviewed in a paper drafted by the Middle East Department in January 1984, where the pressure could be applied on Baghdad to return the hulls. The paper concluded that it could not, and that any such approach would merely alert the Iraqis to how badly the vehicles were wanted. There was a further complication. British aerospace, Vickers, and other defence firms were, throughout the 1980s, engaged in exactly the export activity, to Iran under the Shah, to Jordan, to Kuwait, to Oman, that had opened the loss vectors in the first place. The Ministry of Defence's Defence Sales Organisation, later renamed the Defence Export Services Organisation, and run in the 1980s by Sir Colin Chandler, was under Treasury pressure to maximise export earnings. Every chieftain sold abroad was a chieftain whose technology might one day end up on a Soviet workbench. But every chieftain sold abroad was also several £1 million in the balance of payments and thousands of jobs at Elswick and Leeds. The trade-off was not a security question, it was an economic one, resolved in favour of exports at every meeting of the Cabinet's Overseas and Defence Policy Committee throughout the decade. The Ministry of Defence's response was to accelerate the Challenger 2 programme. Design work at Vickers, under a specification issued in 1986, aimed at a tank whose Chobham 2 array would remain effective against Soviet ammunition, projected for the year 2000. The programme was compartmented under a security regime tighter than anything Chieftain had ever known. Access was restricted, drawings numbered and tracked, and Vickers employees on the programme subjected to developed vetting rather than the ordinary security check. The tightening came too late for the first-generation secrets. Those were already gone. What the tightening protected, successfully as far as the archives yet show, was the second generation. Then the Cold War ended. The ending arrived in stages, and each stage generated a new Whitehall paper on what to do about the tanks. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall opened. In February 1990, the Warsaw Pact effectively dissolved as a military alliance. In July 1990, at the London NATO summit hosted at Lancaster House, Margaret Thatcher and George H.W. Bush agreed a declaration that offered the Soviet Union what Thatcher called the hand of friendship. The Ministry of Defence in Whitehall was already commissioning the studies that would become, in 1990, the Options for Change Review, the programme that would cut the British Army by nearly a third and withdraw 4 of the 7 BAOR armoured regiments back to the United Kingdom. The intelligence question was different. Whitehall now had, for the first time, an opportunity to walk into the archives of the KGB and GRU and read exactly what had been taken. Officers from MI5 and SIS travelled to Moscow, to Warsaw, and to Prague in 1991 and 1992 under a variety of covers, negotiating with successor services that were themselves uncertain who they now worked for. Some material was recovered. Vasili Mitrokhin, the KGB archivist who had for years been secretly copying files from Yasenevo, made contact with SIS at the British Embassy in Riga in April 1992 and was exfiltrated with a suitcase full of notes. The Mitrokhin material, when it reached Sentry House and was worked through by the Sovblock Controllerate over the following 2 years, contained references to more than 1,000 Line X technical intelligence operations run against Western targets. A significant proportion, Christopher Andrew, the authorized historian of MI5, later put it at over 200, concerned British armour, aviation, and naval technology. Chieftain appeared repeatedly. Chobham appeared repeatedly. Challenger appeared, but with strikingly less depth than its predecessor. The Mitrokhin Index also identified individuals. Some were long dead. Some were named in ways that did not permit identification. Some were named in ways that permitted identification but not prosecution, because the evidence was uncorroborated and the alleged offences fell outside statutory limits. Melita Norwood, who had passed atomic secrets from the British Non-Ferrous Metals Research Association for 4 decades, was identified from the Mitrokhin papers in 1992, but not exposed publicly until 1999. She was 87 and was never charged. Whether any of the 14 BAOR officers investigated in 1983 appeared in Mitrokhin's index is not recorded in any file yet released. The Cabinet Office confirms only that Mitrokhin's material was distributed to relevant departments and that appropriate actions were taken. The phrase covers everything from arrest to nothing at all. In August 1991, 3 weeks before the coup that ended the Soviet Union, John Major met Boris Yeltsin at Chequers. The Prime Minister was briefed for the meeting by Sir Roderick Braithwaite, the British ambassador in Moscow, and by Sir Percy Cradock, the chairman of the JIC. The briefing pack, later described by Braithwaite in his memoirs, included an assessment of Soviet technological penetration of the British defence sector across the previous 40 years. The assessment ran to 14 pages. Tank technology occupied 5 of them. Craddock's conclusion, as Braithwaite remembered it, was measured. The KGB and GRU had, over the Cold War, obtained a great deal of British technical intelligence. They had failed to obtain the things that mattered most. The things that mattered most were not the drawings. Every intelligence service in the world, given time, will steal drawings. The things that mattered most were the industrial processes. The specific tolerances, the sintering temperatures, the compositional ratios of ceramic to metal, the annealing cycles that turned a drawing into a manufactured plate of Chobham armor capable of stopping a 125mm Sabre round at combat range. Those things existed in the heads of engineers at Chertsey and at the Royal Ordnance Factory at Nottingham. They existed in the muscle memory of production line workers who could not, if asked, have written them down. They were unstealable in the ordinary espionage sense because they were not documented in a form that could be photographed by a Minox in a Cheltenham loft. British Army chieftains served on until 1995 with the Royal Hussars in Germany. They served in Iranian army markings against Saddam Hussein until 1988, and against internal enemies for years after. They served in the Jordanian army into the 2000s. Each chieftain was, in its way, a message that the Soviet Union had never quite managed to read in full. The GRU understood the platform. It never quite understood how to build one. The Challenger one, entering full service in 1983, was the direct beneficiary. In February 1991, during Operation Granby, Challenger squadrons of the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards and the Queen's Royal Irish Hussars engaged Iraqi T-72s of the Tawakalna and Medina divisions across the Iraqi desert. The Iraqi T-72s carried the composite package the Kartsev Bureau had developed from the Kubinka fragments. The Challengers destroyed them at ranges the Iraqi crews could not answer. In the largest tank engagement fought by the British Army since Alamein, and lost no vehicles to enemy fire. A Challenger of the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards, commanded by Captain Tim Purbrick, achieved a confirmed kill against an Iraqi tank at 5,100 meters, the longest confirmed tank-to-tank kill in armoured warfare history. The projectile was British. The gun was British. The armour that would have stopped a Soviet countershot was British. The intelligence system that had protected the crucial 20% of the design from Soviet acquisition was British. Michael Bettaney was serving his 23-year sentence at HMP Coldingley in Surrey. Geoffrey Prime was serving his 35 years at HMP Long Lartin in Worcestershire. Oleg Gordievsky, under the alias by which he now lived in a safe house in the home counties, watched the Iraqi campaign on the BBC and telephoned his SIS handlers to congratulate them. Melita Norwood was tending her garden in Bexley Heath, unmolested and unknown. The Cold War archive relating to British tank technology remains in the reading rooms at Kew, only partially open. The 1983 vetting files are closed until 2039. The Mitrokhin distribution logs are closed indefinitely. The identity of the officer, if any, who was watched in BAOR in the summer of 1983 has never been made public. Whether the KGB and GRU won or lost the hunt for Chieftain depends on the standard used. They obtained material. They failed to obtain victory. The tanks they built with the material they got were, when the moment came in the Iraqi desert in February 1991, not good enough. The tanks the British built with the secrets they kept were. Britain's finest hour in the long twilight struggle from Berlin to Kuwait was fought not only by soldiers. It was fought by the men and women who decided day by day what could and could not be allowed out of a filing cabinet in Whitehall.